Thank you for joining us on the third and final webinar in our three-part series on international students, which Nebi is delighted to co-host with the Global Alliance for International Student Advancement, the New England Council, and the New Hampshire College and University Council. In the first episode of our series, we discussed the evolving federal policy landscape, some of the challenges and opportunities associated with international student recruitment now and post-COVID, and the strategies for engaging international students throughout the recruitment process. In the second episode, we took a deeper dive into what institutions can do for international students once they've enrolled and are on campus. The session panelists spoke about the effective strategies for addressing international students' unique needs and mitigating retention challenges. In this session, we'll explore ways in which our region's higher education leaders can effectively advocate for policies that not only encourage international students to attend the New England's post-secondary institutions, but also support their re-entry into the region's workforce post-graduation. We'll hear from an author of a new report on recommendations that President Biden and his administration can take to reverse the prior administration's highly restrictive international student policies. The life cycles of international students from the perspective of a community college and from a college career education center. And finally, look into one New England state's for search for tech talent in an increasingly globalized workplace. Please feel free to ask questions at any point in time by putting those questions in the question and answer box. My wonderful Nebi colleague, Stephanie Murphy, will be monitoring that box and ask your questions throughout the discussion. We'll also leave time at the end of the session for additional audience questions. My name is Stafford Pete, and I'm a senior consultant at the New England Board of Higher Education, and we'll be moderating today's session. Thank you again for being with us. As a reminder, today's meeting is being recorded and will be sent to registrants in a post-event email later this week. We're fortunate to have with us four terrific panelists, and I have the pleasure of introducing each, starting with Julie Demmers. Julie Demmer serves as the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Tech Alliance, a statewide technology organization committed to nurturing a vibrant tech ecosystem in the state. She has an impressive and extensive knowledge of the state's business community. Julie also serves as New Hampshire's Sector Partnership Initiative as a technology sector advisor, assisting Granite State companies faced with workforce and training challenges. Stephanie Kim is a professor of practice in the School of Continuing Studies and an inaugural faculty director in the Master's in Higher Education Administration program at Georgetown University. Her work appears in a number of journals and edited columns, and has received awards and extensive media coverage, including Coming to America, Reopening the United States to International Students. We'll be referencing her report during the webinar. She is currently working on a book titled Global Student Pipeline about higher education reform and international student mobility in the post-recession era. Ella Kiowska is the director of the International Center at Bunker Hill Community College in Boston. Ella has over 13 years of experience in higher education administration, working with international and study abroad students and scholars. She also co-led a comprehensive internationalization effort while at Salem State University in collaboration with the American Council on Education. And finally, Jennifer Pollard is the Associate Provost and Executive Director of Wellesley College's Career Education. In this role, Jen leads the ongoing evolution of Wellesley's award-winning career education model and strategy. Before coming to Wellesley, she served at George Mason University's Career Center, and before that as a client strategist for a digital agency that managed large-scale marketing research for companies like eBay, Target, Starbucks, and Whirlpool. This is the part of the conversation in which we delve into sort of key questions, and we have our wonderful panelists being able to respond to those key questions. I'd like to start off this morning's discussion with Stephanie Kim. Stephanie, in your report, Coming to America, Reopening America to International Students, you point to the Trump administration's restrictions that did more than just restrict the entry of international students. They harmed the global perceptions of the US brand and sent a message that the United States does not welcome international students. In the last 4 years, the higher education sector has had to take on the burden of having to try to change such perceptions in spite of the governmental restrictions and political rhetoric that signal otherwise. Stephanie, I'd like to ask you, what steps can institutions in the Biden administration take to restore international students' confidence that the US is a safe and welcoming place?
Right. Well, thank you so much, Stafford, for highlighting the report that I authored and for inviting me here today. So before getting into some of the recommendations that I made in the report, I'd actually like to back up a little bit and talk about the impetus behind it. So I worked on this report in the earlier part of this calendar year, during the first 100 days of the Biden administration. And it was published in early April with Data Catalyst Institute, which is a DC-based think tank. And the goal was really to help those in the Biden administration and in various policymaking positions understand the policy landscape for international students that was left behind by the Trump administration, and then from there take appropriate action. So the main takeaway from the report is that while COVID-19 did certainly negatively affect international students' ability to come to the US, the harmful government restrictions that soon followed made it much, much worse. And that severely damaged global perceptions of the US as a safe and welcoming place. Now, there were a number of harmful restrictions, and I believe you covered many of these in your previous webinars. Just to give some of the highlights, of course, these included travel bans, visa restrictions, threats to OPT, optional practical training, and suspension of the H-1B work visa. And I know we'll get into the nuts and bolts of these restrictions later, so I won't go into them now, but to return to your question, Stafford, what steps can the Biden administration take to restore international students' confidence in the US? Well, the answer really comes down to rolling back these harmful measures, most of which were deployed as executive orders and proclamations without broad political support. And so this means removing travel bans from countries where there are still travel bans, and that, by the way, has happened in limited measure for international students specifically. It means developing procedures that will enable the quick and efficient processing of student visas, many of which are severely backlogged even as of today. And last but certainly not least, it means preserving policies that allow for post-graduation work opportunities for international students. And I just want to say this before we move on to the insights that my fellow panelists will share from the perspectives of their own institutions. The allure of the US for international students today is not just about the higher education that they will receive. It's also about the valuable work experience that they can potentially attain in the US, even if they eventually return to their home countries. Now, as a scholar of global higher ed, I do a lot of research on changing international student mobility patterns. And I know from my own work, as well as the work of many other scholars out there, that in especially the major sending countries like China, India, South Korea, the job market back home for these students is really quite saturated with US degree holders. And so new prospective students today are really looking for that value add when deciding whether and when and whether and where to study abroad. Will my American education help me get a job? Will it be worth the costly investment? And the answers to those questions are often very much tied to their ability to complement their education with valuable work experience in the US. So it's absolutely critical that the Biden administration preserve those policies that allow for this in order to keep the American higher education sector attractive and competitive.
Well, it's interesting, Stephanie. We had an opportunity to talk to 3 enrollment managers at New England colleges. And this is probably a few weeks after the President Biden was sworn in as our president. And what they noted was there was an uptick in international student applications. So just having a new president seemed to be a good sign for them that that the U.S. was now open and open to international students. So even without those policies being changed, at least international students are getting the message that that President Trump is no longer in office. So I think that's a good sign.
Absolutely, I agree.
I think I want to ask sort of the same kind of question to both Jennifer Pollard and Ella about your respective institutions. And I want to start with Jen. Jen, Wellesley College from your website has 343 international students out of a total enrollment of 2,534. What steps can career services take going forward to signal to international students that their centers are safe and a welcoming place to gain support?
Sure. So thank you for having me. I'm excited to bring the career education perspective to the conversation because I think Stephanie is absolutely right. We have international students who are coming with expectations of working in the United States for at least some part of their career. And so preparing them during all 4 years is critical because we know, especially for international students, starting early in the process and planning that post-graduation outcome and pathways means that they will have those opportunities available to them. Starting late in the game can be detrimental in that process. So for us as a career center, it really starts in building a place of trust. And this is something that we are continuing to work on and partnering with our international student office. We know that our international students come and go to that office for everything from course selection advice to career advice because they feel that the staff in that office understand the individual challenges that they face. So what it means is that students need to see us from the first day as a partner with them in having training on the CPT, OPT, H-1B visa issues that they will face throughout their career, whether they want to stay in the US or they want to work globally. It means communicating directly to these students. We've heard from them that if they see programs about internships that don't say this is open to international students, they will count themselves out. And if they don't build those connections and have the experiential learning, it really detrimentally impacts their career mobility later on. So we call out the programs, we talk to them proactively about how you will make it work as an international student. In the past, I think a lot of career centers have been reactive, where you launch a program and then an international student wants to participate. And then on the back end, we're working with the employer to figure out the issues around CPT and course credit and the curricular integration component. And so being proactive both helps the students and the employers be able to actively participate and both meet their goals. And finally, again, just bringing alums and employers into the 4-year experience. I can't stress enough, and I'll talk about this again later, how we're building programs for these students into the 4-year experience, but bringing international alums in who have worked both in the United States and abroad and having them talk to the students about what were those conversations like with employers? How did you advocate and articulate for the value an international student brings to an employer's workplace? How did you navigate a multinational corporation and deciding where and when you would choose to work in the world. And I think, again, what they see from the alums is that having multiple pathways is the best ticket to success for you as an international student. So making sure you're not defining success as one outcome and then feeling like you've failed and that there aren't other options available to you. We try to make sure that our international students know that there are a variety of paths and opportunities for them, and that they pursue all of those options and see that as a way for them to stay in the United States if they hope to do so.
Well, I've heard over and over again, Jen, that the Wellesley alums are not quite the backbone of the college, but they really serve as advisors. They serve as mentors. They serve as, in the case you pointed out, as guides, and hopefully even providing students with employment opportunities. So I know that Wellesley College is fortunate in having such a strong alumni or alum. And so, but at this point in time, I want to ask a similar question to Ella about Bunker Hill Community College. So doing a little bit of research, I found out that Bunker Hill Community College has more international students than any other community college in New England. I think last year, maybe perhaps even the year before, there were 522 international students from 83 countries. So Ella, what makes Bunker Hill Community College such an attractive destination? And how is the college conveying to international students that Bunker Hill is a safe and supporting college?
Well, thank you to my co-panelists for having me here with this wonderful companionship, and thank you for inviting us from Bunker Hill. I think that we can point several components or factors that students who are considering joining us take into consideration. They can have different value, and when people do consider and make the decisions, but I want to point few. One of them, I think it's very convenient and efficient admission process. We collect no fees. Students can easily apply to fully online application. We no longer require any documents to be mailed to our office. Everything can be submitted electronically. We have no hard deadlines to apply, and we offer 3 flexible start dates, which is very important flexibility for many international students who have to navigate very strict deadlines. And I think we pride ourselves in a very timely review of admissions that we receive and timely communication of status updates of all our admission applications. I think another factor that speaks for us, it's the location in Boston. I mean, Boston itself as a vibrant international city, it's very well known in the world, and this is the destination for education for many international students. So we find that when someone arrives in Boston, students really feel like they are at home. And feeling at home and sense of belongings, I think it's also what contributes to it. It's the diversity of our faculty, staff, and students. Many did comment on the fact that when you come and visit our campus, when we were open, you immediately feel like you belong here, and this is the home, second home away. I think another strength, and we communicated to our students, is the clear path that students who join Bunker Hill can really have. And I think long-term planning opportunity and having this vision, it's important for our applicants and their families. We offer intensive English program. It's a new initiative here at Bunker Hill, so students can improve their English, move to the degree program, and work with our transfer counselors in transitioning into one of the four-year universities locally or away to pursue bachelor degree. I think we cannot mention cost and affordability. We are the second most affordable community college in Massachusetts. And I think support services and extracurricular activities available to students are important as well. having dedicated office that provides support services to international student population. I think it's a very strong commitment to our international student population, and having the generous transfer policies allowing students or applicants to transfer credits earned abroad or at another institution. And I think the prior experience of fellow students, classmates, family members here at Bunker Hill, it's also another factor, an endorsement that we receive, and this is why students feel comfortable to approaching us. And we cultivate the relationship, respond in a timely manner, answer questions again and again, making sure that students feel heard and supported.
So, Elle, I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
And if you were to provide advice to other community colleges in New England
Sure.
on how best to recruit international students, what advice would you provide?
I think, recruitment, as many colleagues who work in this field and are responsible for it, we all know that this is not a project that you are done once and it's over. It's a long-term commitment that requires commitment of resources and staff time. It's very important in working in the recruitment area is building relationships. You build and establish relationships and you cultivate them for years. Longevity and presence at trade shows, visiting and following up with your partners. I think another area that we need to explore is embracing working with agents. This has been controversial in some regions about a year and a half, 2 years ago. Paying commission for recruiting students, this was ethical issue. Now I think there is more support and many more colleges started working with agents. And there are also agencies who are accrediting international agents, making sure that we follow ethical practices and policies while we work with students. Many colleagues, and you here working with the younger generation, embrace the peer-to-peer engagements. Engage your students, your alumni with the students in the enrollment pipeline. And from the moment they inquire about admission to your school through the admission process, arrival, and while they are on campus, the ability to be able to connect with your peer and ask the question that you might be shy to ask your advisor or professor, I think it's incredibly important as well. And I think engage and talk to your campus community about the importance on really evaluating the services and the experience that our students have on our campuses to constantly improve how we can better serve our international students.
I think that last recommendation really hits it home. Listen to students because they're the ones that are going to provide you with, I think, the key answers you need in order to be a more effective and as an institution, not only in recruiting international students, but also supporting them while they're here.
Stafford, I'm going to jump in really quickly. We have an anonymous question posed by an audience member for Jennifer, asking if you could clarify what you mean about being proactive when it comes to students, career services, and employers.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I was going to talk about it a little bit later, but happy to talk about it now too. I think when we're used to as career centers doing employer development and outreach, we're used to focusing on what we would consider a traditional domestic student. And we oftentimes forget to even ask in building that partnership, what is their support for international students? What does it look like? By asking those simple questions, it gives us an opportunity to, if they are very open and have very, established practices for bringing international students into their corporation, to promote those, to know about those, to talk to our students about the employers that have set aside and committed time and financial resources to help those students make that happen. It also means if they address barriers, if they address concerns, that we can have that conversation, that we can talk about what OPT is, how students can self-sponsor, how there are multiple pathways through this process. And I think until you ask the question and build that into your employer and your alum outreach, you don't get to have those rich conversations. It's important that we feel as dedicated to our international students in getting them employment opportunities as we do to our domestic students. And I think that's the promise and the return that comes from heavy recruitment. And we bring them here and we talk to them about making sure they can have those opportunities. So I do feel deeply responsible in everything our team does to open that conversation and have that dialogue. And it also means for me that I can go back to our international student office and ask questions and have them help us guide us in those relationships with employers and really see them as this expertise and this resource around visa issues and how we help to promote those conversations and work with employers through that process.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. I think you'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about that, the content embedded in that answer later in the session. I'd like to turn it over to the sort of the, and Jen, you mentioned OPT, which is optional training program, and it really permits international students who graduate from a U.S. Degree program to remain in the U.S. to work for a year as a practical training that complements their education. I think the Trump administration threatened to end the program, and albeit that threat was never realized, the Trump administration stopped issuing immigration or immigrant visas. However, in February 2021, the Biden administration revoked the Trump proclamations and resumed the issuance of immigrant visas. However, Stephanie, from your report, and I'm mining your report, the issuance of non-immigrant visas, including H-1B work visas that allows highly skilled immigrants to work in specialty professions in the United States, is still suspended. And I think that was as of April 1st. And the importance of that is that if you continue to the suspension, albeit it doesn't apply to international students, it does block international students from obtaining H-1B work visas should they wish to stay in the United States and work upon graduation. And research has clearly shown us that highly skilled and trained graduates in the STEM fields often seek out an H-1B work visa as a first step to legal employment and residency in the US. So, Stephanie, what's the status? Has it changed since April 1st when you made that finding in your report?
Right. So thank you, Stafford, for the question. Yeah, so as you summarized very well, last year, starting in April 2020, the Trump administration issued a number of proclamations which suspended all immigrant and non-immigrant visas, including the H-1B work visa. The rationale behind those moves was to supposedly protect the American labor market as much of the economy went into lockdown because of the pandemic. Once Biden was elected, he revoked most of those proclamations and initially resumed the issuance of the immigrant visas and then eventually the non-immigrant visa. So actually, Stafford, as of April 1st, the H-1B work visa is effectively back on the table. The issuance it has now begun again. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so no problem.
That's good news.
Yeah, good news. But why the flip-flopping matters, particularly for the higher education sector, is it further damaged international students' confidence in the U.S. as a viable place to study. And as we all have mentioned earlier, their desire to study in the U.S. is often closely connected to their desire to work in the U.S. after graduation. And of course, Stafford, as you mentioned, the H-1B work visa in particular often serves as a first step to legal employment in the US for these students, particularly for those with advanced degrees in the STEM fields. And actually, more often than not, those advanced degree holders come from US colleges and universities rather than directly from abroad. In terms of what this means for the American economy, I mean, why wouldn't the US want to retain the very talent that its colleges and universities have cultivated? Why wouldn't we want to retain a scientist with a PhD and make use of her skills at an American company? And I think all of this starts with reframing how policymakers view international students. So rather than view international students only in terms of the dollars that they bring into the country, they have to start viewing international students as contributors to American human capital. And I think research universities in particular have long done this, have long viewed international students as sources of talent, well before they also became sources of tuition revenue. And it's really time that policymakers start doing the same, because it's a continuous pipeline between higher education and the labor market. Colleges and universities are essentially pipelines for highly skilled individuals from overseas to then segue into the American workforce.
Stephanie, you made some terrific recommendations to the Biden administration at this point on preserving post-graduation work opportunities for international students. I wonder if you could just share a few of those recommendations to our audience, and sort of as a maybe a little bit deeper dive into what needs to be done next.
Sure. So initially, I think this begins with first preserving the temporary work opportunities that are available, such as OPT, the H-1B work visa. We've seen numerous threats to both of these in the last several years. And so there has to be some kind of assurance from the Biden administration that these opportunities will remain in place. Thinking more long-term, there has to be more comprehensive immigration reform. And actually the beginnings of this are in the Biden immigration bill. The bill explicitly permits dual intent for international students, meaning that they would be able to pursue permanent residency while still a student. And as things currently stand, that's not possible at the moment. But permitting dual intent would essentially benefit international students because it facilitates their ability to secure legal employment in the US without having to first pursue a temporary option. It, of course, also benefits colleges and universities because it facilitates their ability to help their students secure employment. And it also benefits employers because it facilitates their ability to hire international students. And so I think that actually the Biden administration is on the right track with the immigration bill.
Well, we're going to dip back into your report a little bit later on in the session. But I also think about other countries who've really made it a concerted effort to reach out to immigrants to work. And I'll bring this up a little bit later on as well, is we have our neighbor to the north has recognized the value of immigrants. And certainly New Zealand got a lot of press last year before the pandemic about changing their immigration policies as well. So at this point, I'd like to bring Julie Demmer into the conversation. Julie, this is what I read from your website. The New Hampshire Tech Alliance has 4 value pillars, including talent and workforce development. For this pillar, the Alliance's goal is to ensure the state has sufficient human capital to address the technology-related workforce needs into the future. With that goal in mind, what is the state of New Hampshire's human capital to meet the present and future demands of employers?
Thank you, Stafford, and thank you for having me today. So I love that question. I don't love the answer to it. So going into, I would say March of 2020, heading into the pandemic, New Hampshire, the latest report that I read, New Hampshire had a 2,500, right around there, a deficit of 2,500 jobs that ultimately went unfilled because we didn't have the talent to fill them. And that was specifically in the tech sector alone. So we work collaboratively across 5 different sectors under the Sector Partnerships Initiative to address workforce. But most of what I'll talk about today is going to be focused on tech because that is my world. That is what I am the most familiar with. So the pandemic hit. As a membership organization, we immediately went into this mode of doing a pulse check with our members, seeing how they were holding up, seeing what their concerns were. we did a formal survey asking what our members were most concerned about. And this is relative to the pandemic. And the number one response, and among, I think, almost 60% of the respondents, was still workforce. They were worried that they weren't going to be able to fill the vacancies that they had in mid to senior level roles in technology. So I think that was very telling, right? And I think the technology sector as a whole, it wasn't entirely insulated, but it was somewhat insulated from the challenges that you saw in other sectors in the middle of a pandemic where the world shuts down. All of a sudden, there's a need for the technology that allows us to do a webinar in the way that we're doing it now, that allows teams to work remotely and communicate with each other. So I think the pandemic, if anything, sort of underscored the need for talent. So right now, I think that number has maybe decreased a little bit. It's sort of a natural expectation of where we're at and sort of where we're heading. But we anticipate operating in that talent deficit for quite some time. And what that has created is an environment in New Hampshire where it's an all hands on deck mentality, right? So it is very easy to communicate with employers, to make the connections between industry and the education systems, to try to fill some of these gaps, because I feel, I'm trying to find the right word. I think desperate is what I'm going to land on. Our employers are desperate for talent, right? And I think we'll talk later in this about how that's shifting with the growth and more acceptance of remote work. But I would say that the silver lining to that is you have a state to the north of the gravity of the Boston sort of tech scene that is really, really willing to work with higher education partners to bring on international students. I think when you look at the numbers that we're going to graduate in tech-specific degree programs, right, we're not even going to scratch the surface of that deficit. And that's even if we were able to retain all of the students that graduated from New Hampshire schools in state, which we know we're going to lose more than half of them typically anyways. So I think, it's definitely an issue for us. I think it remains one of the most pressing issues for our membership, which is representative of the tech ecosystem in New Hampshire as a whole. So we have a lot of progress to make there. I always laugh. My favorite story, we're connecting with someone at the airport that was trying to attract airlines to the Manchester-Boston Regional Airport, and he was connecting with a senior level exec at one of a pretty major global airline, and they said, well, why would we want to go to New Hampshire? New Hampshire is old and cold. So really what we have is a perception issue. New Hampshire's economy is a high-tech economy. We have a very high median wage. It's a great place to live, but we have a bit of a perception issue. And I think our opportunities often get overlooked when people are sort of feeling that natural pull to our neighbors below. So there's a deficit. That's why it's one of our 4 value pillars. I will say it is the one that we are actively doing the most work on, and it trickles into everything else that we do. So.
Well, Jen, I had a follow-up question for you, but I think within the context of that response, because the question was, with the world in competition for tech talent, what's the New England strategy? And it sounds like it's all hands on deck. So I think.
Yeah, and I'm happy to sort of elaborate on that all hands on deck, because
sure.
I think the way New Hampshire does it is very unique, right? So when in talking through the way the Sector Partnerships Initiative works, right, there's the tech sector, there's 4 other sectors that are represented through various trade organizations. So you have technology, hospitality, healthcare, manufacturing, and then construction. So each trade organization in the state of New Hampshire that represents that industry, right, is at the table. And there's a direct line to our Business and Economic Affairs office at the state of New Hampshire Hampshire. So when we talk about addressing the workforce challenges, it's really part of a larger talent attraction campaign that's happening at the state level. So when I say all hands on deck, it's very collaborative, right? Because I think one of the biggest issues that the state would have in attracting new business is that talent deficit. So they sort of recognize that this needs to be solved holistically. This needs to be solved with a brain trust of the people who are working in these industries and organizations on a daily basis. So I think the strategy is to do what New Hampshire does best, which is to roll up our sleeves, appreciate the proximity to the legislators that we have, to state officials, and we're all really working together on a monthly, if not even weekly basis to try and address the talent issues.
Well, thank
Julie,
you.
I have an audience question for
Sure.
you, asked by another anonymous attendee, asking if you can be more specific about what kinds of roles the New Hampshire Tech Alliance members are seeking to fill. Are STEM analytics students considered tech, or are you looking for software developers, programmers, engineers, etc.?
Yeah, so in terms of the software developers, programmers, and engineers are sort of always at the top of the list, but as an organization, we recognize that tech spans all sectors, right? So when we're promoting to fill vacancies in tech companies, and not only tech companies, also employers that have large technical teams, we're thinking of the most broad definition of the term. So we also have a sector, an initiative that focuses on the biomed tech sector. There's a ton of activity happening there with Army, the Advanced Regenerative Manufacturing Institute, and the biofab, so tissue manufacturing, right? So we are, because of the nature of things, we're sort of the voice for a lot of those industries. There's a bit of overlap between our sector and manufacturing, obviously, because advanced manufacturing has a very technical component. So if it's helpful, we view tech in the most broad of terms. And when we're sort of scanning and sort of taking an assessment of where those vacancies are, we want to understand it all. And if it doesn't necessarily fall in our wheelhouse, we work really closely with the other 5 sectors to make sure that we're assisting with strategies to build their talent pipelines as well.
Julie, thanks for answering that question.
Of course.
It's I think not only New Hampshire is facing this issue, but certainly all of New England and probably all of the United States. So maybe we can learn something from New Hampshire's efforts. Oh,
yeah, maybe we'll have a better answer to that question next time.
Right. So I'd like to turn it over. Jen, you fielded a question really earlier about developing sort of a career life cycle for Wellesley students, including pathways and support for international students. It was a great answer, but I was just going to see whether or not you had any additional thoughts that you could add to your earlier response.
Sure. Yeah. So I talked a lot about employers in the previous response. And I think, for our students, it starts well before the employer engagement. It really starts the moment that they come to campus. And this is something that we're developing to really launch in the next year or so, but starting with a first year experience for all students that allows students to then break into cohorts based on their identity, whether they're an international student, a student athlete, connecting with peers that will go through similar challenges in relation to planning their futures and postgraduate plans. Then it really goes into 3 years of experiential learning and mentorship for all students, including our international students. The mentorship is a really exciting project we've been working on that's come out of the pandemic, where because everybody went virtually, we set up these pods for our students. And we made these matches that were very interesting, where we set up a pod that was, for example, 3 students with 3 alums that met as a group. And they had a similar focus, whether it was international students and alums who had previously been international students, in the tech space, in the business space, allowing the students to connect with their peers who have similar interests, and also connecting with a young alum who just navigated the current administration and all of the legal issues that are happening and that student will face, as well as a more mid to senior level that may have worked both in the US and outside of the US, that has dealt with issues of advancement. How do you continue to, really navigate your career as administrations change, as legal issues change? And so that will be something we continue. We're starting in the sophomore year. International students will have the opportunity to join these support pods that will, carry with them throughout their 3 sophomore, junior, senior year and into graduation. And then the other one, experiential learning. So again, another really powerful benefit that came out of the pandemic was we developed what we call internship projects, and they are designed to be completed virtually, where employers don't have to have the high lift of designing a 3-month internship. They can think of experiential learning in terms of 4-week projects where a student can work with them from campus, from an international location, for wherever they may be in the summer, and partner and work on that hands-on employer-centric project. These help because it means before graduation, our international students can really expand that network where they can have, again, multiple alums who are supporting them, as well as multiple employers who have witnessed their work ethic, the unique skills that they're bringing to the workplace. That's often how we get our international students into small to mid-sized companies, is by having them go through experiential learning pathways where that employer is going to advocate for that student, even if there is no formal international student recruitment entry-level job pipeline established within that organization. So again, it's about unlocking that 80% or so of jobs that we know never get posted before they get filled to our international students as well, and making sure that they have those support networks that will carry with them far beyond when they graduate.
Well, it seems to me that Wellesley College is really addressing the sort of the priorities of international students, especially those from the middle class who expect a good return on investment when they come to the US. And I think there have been multiple surveys that illustrate that international students rate employment and career opportunities as the #1 reason they come to study abroad. It just sounds like that you're addressing those needs at Wellesley. I think for those of you who want to find out more about what Wellesley is doing, I would suggest reaching out to Jen, because they've come a long way since the center was open. And is it, Jen, is 2016? I think
2016. And so now we're sort of in this evolution, this next chapter where the 4-year experience is kind of coming out. And this plan feels a bit more strategic, a bit more central to the student experience in the college. And we keep learning, right? We keep learning from what's working well and what's not, and trying to do our work a little bit better. So,
well, at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Ella. Ella, there aren't a whole lot of community colleges in New England with an international center, and you have a staff of 5.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what the services that are provided outside, perhaps, of the center, or unless you really handle issues of transfer, career advising, and work-based learning experiences?
No, so International Center has been designed and provides core services in 3 main areas. As I mentioned, recruitment and admission of international students, the full scope of support services for international students who are on our campus. We advise them about, we talk in a work employment theme here. So we advise on CPTs and OPTs, and we work students in great detail, educating them about when and how to apply for such opportunity. And we also are administering study abroad opportunities for all Bunker Hill students. So we are not directly involved with transfers when you talk about credit of transfer and next step, but we closely collaborate and invite our colleagues from other offices to support international students. We have and host workshops that are targeted and designed, tailored towards the need of international students, and encourage our international students kind of to join I call it the mainstream, the events that are prepared for all of our Bunker Hill students. So career exploration starts in a very first encounter with a new student with an academic advisor, where they explore how their vision of a student, what they would like to do, let's say 3-4 years from now, matches the major they have selected. So we try to see, is this a good fit? We have very young and dynamic team in the Career and Internship Services office, and they have some tremendous progress in creating opportunities for work-based learning. I'm very happy to hear, and I cannot wait. We expect that spring 2022, every major that is offered at Bunker Hill Community College will have an opportunity embedded class in the curriculum, allowing students who are interested in having practical experience in the field to pursue it. I checked in with my colleague who is director of this office, and she confirmed that they have quadrupled the number of placement sites for our students in the year and a half. And they secured additional funding for students. It's a $500,000 every year to support students who want to do internships. And I think a lot of support is given to our students in securing academic internships. We have internships called Learn and Earn, where we guarantee that students are paid a salary of at least $1,800, and they have travel stipends. We help students with pre and practicum placements. We also have opportunity and match students, like Jennifer mentioned, match students with mentors in their field of study, often recruited among Bunker Hill alumni. And we also try to look for project-based learning opportunities. For example, computer science majors often work on providing a real-life solution for local business that needs a solution. So students develop apps, and they are being used by their neighbors. So and talking about transfers too, because I cannot not to mention it, I think we are making incredible progress in pursuing new articulation agreements and updating existing ones to make sure that our students have a very clear path and understanding of what different transfer opportunities and agreements, with different institutions are providing them as well. So we're often in the middle of kind of coordinating the connections and traffic and, between students and different offices, really to support their long-term goal.
Well, it sounds like you do a lot of leveraging of relationships.
Yes, we are matchmaker.
You're a matchmaker.
For many, yes.
So we're at the home stretch, if you will, of this webinar, but we have a few more questions, and I'm going to sort of go back to to Stephanie Kim. And I think this question really is, Stephanie, I want you to mine your report again. And what else does the president do in thinking about the future in order to make US a destination again, a primary destination?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, thinking more long term, I like to take a bit of a comparative perspective here. My specialization is in comparative higher education. So, when we look at some of the alternative study destinations to the US, for example, Canada, the UK, Australia, et cetera, the most important lesson that we can take away from some comparative places is that those countries have increased their world share of international students and actually have a much more coordinated national strategy to do this. So we here in the US, we like to point to Trump as the primary reason for recent declines in international student enrollment, and that's generally true. But actually, the US's world share of international students has been declining for quite some time, for roughly the last 2 decades. So if you look at the year 2000, The US had 23% of world share of international students, but 2 decades later, it's 18%. That's a 5% drop. That's pretty significant. So even though the number of international students has been growing here until, of course, very recently, it's been growing much, much faster in other countries long before Trump was ever in the picture. And so it's really important to point out that the US does not have a national strategy in regards to international students. And that's really to the US's detriment, as we can see in the long-term reduction in world share. So I think that an important long-term action that policymakers can and should be doing is to develop a national strategy to bring in more international students and increase world share. And that would ultimately commit colleges and universities to work alongside rather than often in discoordination with government agencies.
I wonder if I could volunteer you to the Biden administration to develop that strategy, Stephanie.
Sure. If he is watching, I would be very open to chatting.
So once again, I'm dipping into the future because that's kind of where we will end up eventually. And this is a question for Julie, and I think the question is really about what, and I think Julie, you've talked about this before. You've said that that the pandemic related changes, and you referenced them earlier, in employer hiring, and that the expectation is that no longer will employees have to be place-based, and which I thought was really an interesting observation. Has a lot to do with the hybrid working setting, but I want to know how is this playing out in New Hampshire? I know that you'll hire a programmer from Massachusetts, but yeah. Will you hire a programmer from Canada? We brought up Canada a few times during our session.
Yeah, it's so funny because if you were to ask me that, I think even the question of hiring a programmer from Massachusetts pre-pandemic, that was hard, right? A lot of our members, even though they're technology-driven, technology-enabled tech companies, really valued the in-person experience. So I think, and I don't think that's unique to New Hampshire. I think there was a hesitancy to lose sort of those water cooler conversations, the environment of working together. And now there's just this sort of global acceptance of it. Some of our largest employers, as they think about the transition back to work, are offering 3 options, and they're calling it a work from anywhere option. So they plan on growing their remote teams, or sometimes on campus option, right? So I think that companies are getting more creative. And I think that means 2 things for New Hampshire. And we're already seeing the first that I'm going to point to. So this idea that you can live anywhere and still work for your company has already blown up New Hampshire's housing market, right? So Manchester, New Hampshire is the nomineral housing market in the country right now, followed by Concord, New Hampshire, which is number 2, because people said, and I might be making some assumptions, but I think people realize that they can do their work from anywhere, and they want to live in a place that most people usually only considered for vacations, right? So we are already seeing that in our own real estate market. And I think for our employers here that have been struggling with talent and might have been a bit more resistant to a remote workforce, well, they've already been doing it for the better half of a year. And I think most of them are finding that with the tools and sort of this widespread acceptance, it's not as bad as they thought it was. And I think we've had a lot of practice now in realizing that we can have remote teams that are engaged and efficient. And I think studies are going to show that more and more companies are going to make it part of their long-term strategy. We did, and I'd like to do it again, we did a webinar not too long ago where we talked about commercial real estate in New Hampshire and how some companies were expanding their footprint to be able to adhere to social distancing guidelines if they had to. but a lot of companies were just closing their offices altogether. So it's very interesting to see. And also, I think as we see individuals moving here, I think as remote work is more widely accepted, we're going to see more companies that maybe didn't make the leap into New Hampshire because they were concerned about some of the workforce challenges that we're facing. But if they're accepting of a remote workforce that they can pull from anywhere, New Hampshire is a pretty friendly business climate. So I think generally the people are feeling pretty positive about those changes and the impact that it's going to have on the state of New Hampshire. I think, of course, we're going to risk losing some people who live in New Hampshire and want to work for companies that are based out of state or out of the country. But yeah, so I think it's very interesting, and I'm very excited because I just wrote down a note in hearing Ella and Jennifer also with those project-based internships. I'm like, great, how do we sign New Hampshire companies up? So I think there's going to be a lot of cross-pollination, a lot of collaboration, and I think we're going to continue to see those sort of invisible barriers around our state disappear a little bit.
Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Okay, yes or no? Is this a trend or is this a fad?
A trend or a fad? No, I think we've went through a very transformative part in our history as a country. I think this is going to be the new norm.
Okay.
The new norm. I hate that. That phrase, but I do.
Stephanie, do you have any questions from the audience that Stephanie Murphy could share with our panelists?
I do. I have two sort of interrelated questions that we could ask. I know we're running up against time, so ask these two together and then we can move into closing remarks. But two interrelated questions from Marcia Sun and Clay Hensley. One is asking for clarification on the distinction between world share and number of international students. These questions are directed towards Stephanie. Clarification between distinction between world share and number of international students. And then a second set of questions asking, is world share important to US higher education institutions if the pool of internationally mobile students continue to expand as significantly as it has? Also, can the approach by US higher ed institutions actually be a strength compared to the centralized Commonwealth way?
Great
Well, that was
questions.
a short question.
Sure. Great questions, and I'll try to be very brief. So to answer the first question, what is the difference between the number versus world share? So the number is the absolute number of international students. World share is the percentage of international students relative of all students who move overseas for their higher education, relative to the percentage of that go to other countries. So in the last 2 decades, the number of students who cross borders for higher education has actually more than doubled. But the world share of the US has actually been decreasing. So even though we're seeing steady growth, relative to other countries, the growth in other countries was much greater, and which is why we see a decreased world share in the US. Addressing the second question, I'll try to do the best I can. I think it's still important to keep in mind world share because it gives us a bit of perspective. I mean, we like to focus on the absolute numbers, but we're not operating in a vacuum. The US is very much interconnected. And many of the trends that we had seen starting from the financial crisis, I think will only be amplified in our current moment. For example, competition for international students, not just among institutions, but among alternate host destinations and alternate host countries. I will say this too, that when you take a comparative stance on the proportion of international students within each country's higher education sector, the proportion of international students within the US higher ed sector as a whole is actually relatively small compared to some of these other major host countries. And that implies that there's a lot more capacity to host more international students than perhaps some of the other host countries have. So I think that's a really important key point to consider as we think about how to move forward.
Well, I think we're fighting against the clock at this point, and I just want to thank all of you who joined us. A special shout out to our panelists. It's been a pleasure. It's been a privilege to be your moderator and to learn more about how the US can raise the flag that international students are welcome. In the coming days, we'll be circulating a video of this meeting, so keep an eye out for that and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again.